So the recording has started, I think. Yeah. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today with Polycon UK. We're very happy to have Gaia and Narciso presenting from Madrid, but she's actually based at Trinity College, Dublin, normally. This paper on the intergenerational transmission of conflict, joined with Battista Severgnini, who is also here with us today. So you can ask questions either in the chat. You can also just unmute yourself and ask questions as we go along, or raise your hand, and we'll tell you when it's appropriate to go. So all options are possible. And without further ado, Gaia, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Valeria, for inviting me. So, as Valeria was saying, this is a joint project together with Battista Severgnini from Copenhagen Business School, and as you see from the title, we're going to look at the intergenerational transmission of conflict, where conflict I mean rebellion and unrest. And as you know, there have been quite a few contributions in social sciences, political science, economics, in terms of understanding the causes of conflicts, rebellions, and unrest. And indeed, quite a few drivers have been identified. Political exclusion, inequality, natural resources, economic conditions, and so on. So what we're doing in this paper is to take a long-run perspective and try to understand really the long-run factors that might cause conflict. And so the specific question that we ask in this project is really to look at how large negative shocks can shape the decision of subsequent generations. So generations that were not directly affected by the shock, but subsequent generations to rebel. And as you know, first of all, it's quite difficult to study rebellions, especially using individual level data. But usually when the studies that have looked at rebellions have looked at rebellion ex post, and while doing so, it is quite difficult to disentangle, say, the short-run factors from the long-run factors. And this is exactly what we're trying to do in this paper, where we really try to understand better, not just the short-run factors, which means the characteristics of rebels, but also the long-run factors that may lead individuals to rebel. And so if I were to describe this paper in a nutshell, it's really to try to understand what triggers rebellion in the long run. And as I was saying, we will look at the individual determinants of becoming a rebel. So we will look at the characteristics of rebels, but also we will take a step back and look at how large negative shocks can have an impact on rebellion in the long run. And in doing so, we will focus in particular on the intergenerational transmission of conflict. So how large negative shocks can basically leave a legacy of a conflict that goes over generations. We're going to draw evidence from the Great Irish Famine that took place in Ireland in mid-19th century. The Great Irish Famine was caused by potato blight. I will talk a bit more about the famine. And we will look at the evidence of the relationship between the Great Irish Famine and the Irish Revolution against British rule that took place between 1916 and 1921. And we're going to focus in particular on the causal long-run intergenerational effects. And we do this mainly in two ways. First of all, we will explore surnames and to use surnames and geographical distribution of surnames really to try to understand the mechanism behind the intergenerational transmission of rebellion. And also we will have an instrumental variable analysis that is based on the barometric conditions, so wind direction, that determine the spread of the potato blight that had caused the famine. Feel free to interrupt me at any stage if something is not clear or if you have an impending question. So in a way, the literature we contribute to is not just the literature on conflict, but really the literature that has investigated how memory of past shocks can shape behavior in the long run. The Great Irish Famine was caused by a potato blight, and it was one of the biggest tragedies of modern history. About 1 million people died, either of disease or starvation, and 1 million people migrated out of a population of 8.5 million people. And if you're wondering in terms of what kind of relief was available at the time, Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Ireland. And relief was somehow provided by Westminster, but it took different forms, from public works to workhouses to soup kitchens. The narrative that many historians have highlighted is that although the demographic impact was immediate, 1 million people dying of starvation or disease. So the demographic impact was immediate, but it seems that the politically motivated rebellion kind of smoldered under the surface for several years. And I will talk a bit more about this. So for those of you that don't know much about the Great Irish Famine, I have a couple of slides just to give you some context in terms of the extent of the famine. First of all, the famine, as I was mentioning, was caused by a potato blight, which was basically a fungus. And the fungus arrived from Mexico. It arrived to Europe from Mexico, and then it spread, starting from Belgium, spread to France, Germany, England, Scotland, and Ireland. And the epidemic was extremely severe in Ireland for various reasons. First of all, at the time, the potato was basically the main staple in Ireland. It is estimated that the daily intake of potatoes was about 2 kilos per person in the early 1840s. But also weather conditions also favored the spread of the potato blight in Ireland. And I will spend a bit of time later on to talk a bit about how this fungus can spread. And indeed, there are various different channels through which the fungus can be spread by air. So the spores of the fungus can be spread by air, by water, and also from tuber to tuber. And I have put that mold by air because exactly this is what we're going to explore more in terms of our instrument and looking at how the spores could be transported by wind. So in terms of really the effect of the blight, it is estimated that 1/3 of the potato crop was destroyed in 1845. That's the first year in which the Phytophthora appeared. 1/3 of the potato crop was destroyed. The following year, there was an almost complete failure of the potato crop. And the following year again, 1847, the extent of the blight was minimal. But given that, as you know, you need potatoes to plant and get more potatoes. So there was a limited availability of seed potatoes from the previous years, which means that the total yields were very low. However, given that in 1847, basically the presence of the blight was minimal, farmers planted again potatoes, so whatever was left. And unfortunately, in 1848, it was again a situation of the blight hitting very badly, and the crop failed almost completely. And the blight again appeared in 1849, 1850, but to a lesser extent. So you can see how, for a population that based the entire diet on the potato, having their crops destroyed year after year, how that led to starvation. And as I mentioned, in terms of the demographic impact, Cormac O'Grady has estimated that about 1 million people died during the period of the famine, and 1 million people migrated out of a population of 8.5 million people. Now, people dying, they were not just dying of starvation, most likely they were dying of the disease that was related to very low nutrition. So if you're wondering what happened in terms of support, there is a general consensus among the historians and also critics at the time that British relief was too little, too slow, too conditional, and cut off too soon. And indeed, Amartya Sen, when exploring and studying the Great Irish Famine, what he uses is a term that is cultural alienation. So the famine was considered an Irish problem, and that's why it wasn't really ever provided enough support in terms of relief for the population. So the point that perspective from the United Kingdom was this is an Irish problem, we shouldn't be intervening.
Can I ask a question? So just because you're citing there Ograda and Sen, and I'm not an expert on this literature on famines, but usually, if my understanding is correct, the consensus is that the agricultural shock does not necessarily perfectly correlate with the famine, right? And it's important to consider within the area that's hit other factors, access to markets, proximity to political networks, things like that, that will give you access to food. So does that matter in this context?
So in this context, no, thank you. This is a very important question. So during the period of the famine, it's not that other staples were not available. Indeed, there are data showing that, or evidence showing that Ireland was still exporting grains to Great Britain. So it's not that no food was available. Well, basically, other than the potato, other foods were available, but they were mainly exported. And the potato, again, was really the main staple, but not just for the poorer people in Ireland. It had become, at a certain point in the 1840s, really the main staple for the entire society. I mean, the potato, if you wish, I mean, provides a lot of nutrients, and so it had become slowly the main staple in that sense. But I mean, what you're suggesting, Valeria, is exactly the point, that other staples were available, but they were not kept in Ireland. They were kept on being exported back to Great Britain. In terms of the famine relief that was provided, initially the relief was provided in the form of workhouses, and the workhouses were already in existence in Ireland, but very soon they reached full capacity. And so as a second step in terms of providing relief, Westminster basically initiated a series of public works in Ireland, and the number of people working in public works went from 27,000 to 700,000 within 6 months. And you have to think, however, that here you're asking people who are debilitated because they don't have food to work for a salary, for a wage that didn't really allow to buy enough food, especially given the fact that the main staple was not available anymore. And so very soon it was recognized that the public works were a failure in terms of providing relief. So soup kitchens were introduced to a greater extent. And by summer 1847, 3 million people were in receipt of food rations. So this is the large negative shock that we are going to analyze. And so now I already apologize for this. Let me condense the relationship between Ireland and the United Kingdom and Great Britain in one slide. So I apologize for this, but just wanted to give you an idea of the background, the historical background. So the movement of independence took place between 1916 and 1920. At the time, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And the Irish parliamentary members in Westminster had tried in various occasions of trying to get some form of independence by passing what they call the Home Rule, which would have given some kind of independence to Dublin in the form of a parliament in Dublin. The first two Home Rule bills did not pass Westminster, and eventually the third Home Rule passed in 1914, just before the First World War. And indeed, World War I plays a big role in Irish history in an indirect way, because basically the Home Rule was passed, but given the war, it was never implemented. And also all the issues related to conscription of Irish citizens played a role. In 1916, there was the first significant episode of rebellion, which is the Easter Rising in April 1916. And that was an episode of rebellion that happened mainly in Dublin. That wasn't the original plan, but eventually the rebellion that is the rising only happened in Dublin. But later on, when the War of Independence really started between 1919 and 1921, this was a rebellion that spread across the entire island. And the various rebel groups went under the umbrella of the Irish Republican Army. And the way of the rebellion worked was based on guerrilla tactics, which means basically attacking the various barracks, British barracks spread around the territory. And eventually, the rebellion ended with the Anglo-Irish Treaty being signed in 1921, where the counties on the island were split between Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State, the Republic of Ireland. So this is really condensed version of Irish history. I just wanted to give you an idea of the timeline, especially. So the question is, so we're going to focus on this rebellion that led to the formation of the Irish state. And so the question, of course, is who are the insurgents? And if you think about rebels, rebels are a hidden population by definition. And so it is very difficult to identify in a systematic way. What has been happening over the past few years, given that also there were Ireland was celebrating the 100 years since all these episodes, that a lot of historical data sources have been made available, public, digitized, and this really allow us to identify the characteristics of insurgents and to try to understand the decision to rebel. And this also allow us really to explore more the core of our research question, so the intergenerational transmission of rebellion. So how do we identify rebels? In 1923, so the Irish state had been already formed. The parliament took the decision of providing a pension to all veterans or their spouses and next of kin for those rebels who had died. So all those individuals who had taken part in the Easter Rising and the War of Independence. And so the military archives have over 4,000 applications of individuals who applied for this pension. And so when applying for this pension, individuals had to provide not just their name, but also date of birth, and most especially proof of participation during the War of Independence and Easter Rising, and other information such as the place of residence at the time of the pension application.
So can I ask you something? So here, with regards to the pension application, is there any politics involved? So in the French context after World War II, there's been a lot of studies on the resistance looking at the same types of schemes, but it is well known that people who had an association with the Communist Party wouldn't be given these pensions. So they weren't recognized as resistance for a very long time. So are there any type of similar politics that could have happened?
I asked the same question to Irish historians based at Trinity, because that was also my concern. And the answer was no, that they don't have evidence that this was happening. One thing that I was also concerned is how about people who apply for a pension, even though they had not taken part into the revolution. So as one of the robustness checks that we do is to actually use only the people who got the pension. And you know, when applying for this pension, you had to provide information about where you were involved. And I was reading documents of, say, an individual who was claiming that he had participated in one of the rebellion episodes. He had been denied a pension and then provided further information about his involvement. So my take is that this process was a thorough process. But also, I mean, as I said, as robustness checks, we also just check for those individuals who got the pension, and the results are basically the same. Now, of course, we have the list of rebels. I should say that the main source is the Irish military archives, but also textbooks and history books have helped us in doing this list. Then, of course, you have the list of rebels, and you would like to, if you want to tell a story about who these rebels are, of course, you need the background information about the rest of the population. And the 1911 census is now available. And so what we do basically is to look at the 1911 census, which at the time consisted of over 4 million observations. And the census provides all the information about, of course, name, gender, age, place of birth, religion, literacy, knowledge of Irish language, occupation, and type of disability. And so you already can guess where I'm heading to. What we did, and that required a lot of effort, and well, it was also very time consuming. What we did was to do data matching, so data linking between the list of veterans with the 1911 Irish census. So think in this way: the rebellion took place between 1916 and 1921. The Irish census was just 5 years before the rebellion had started. And linking this data wasn't easy. And so what we did was to adopt two different strategies. One is manual matching, and the other one is automatic matching.
So I have further questions with regards to that. So going back to the pension, is this men and women?
Yes.
So there are two things. What counts as being a rebel, especially when you think about women's involvement in rebellious movements that tend to be a lot of hiding people, providing informal support? Does that count as?
It's interesting because there was at least one rebel group of women. It has an Irish name which I cannot pronounce, but women were deeply involved, and actually one of the main figures in the rebellion is a woman. So the role of women in the rebellion was not marginal.
My problem is more: was it marginalized? So are there types of involvement that don't count for pensions?
Probably what you are suggesting is that we are underestimating the number of women that were involved.
That's a classic.
It is a possibility.
Yeah.
Although the reassurance that I can provide is that given that there were groups of rebels for women, that should kind of be reassuring in terms of really having information about women, and actually here the manual matching is also very important. So let me.
That's what I was gonna ask. Like, how do you deal with women's names?
Exactly. So first of all, let me start with the manual matching. Thanks to the Irish Research Council, we could hire many research assistants who went through this list of rebels and looked them up in the 1911 census. Now, one thing to consider is that many people, not many people, in Ireland, you can have your Irish version of the name or the version of your name in English. So first of all, there was a translation of the Irish names into English, and the manual matching relies on complete name and age, where we give plus minus 2 years because there is evidence of rounding in the census. And we consider all individuals above 60. For women in particular, the manual matching is very good because it allows us basically to look for many women who applied for the pension, we also have their NEE name. And so we can go back into the 1911 census and look for their NEE name before the marriage. So that's something certainly that the manual matching does, and because it allows exploring all the information on the application. From the manual matching, we get two measures. One that is more conservative and one that is less conservative. So in case, the more conservative is one, for example, in which maybe the age is 2 years, and there might be a middle name that we are not too sure about. So in this case, the more conservative wouldn't consider that as a match. The automated matching is based on the automated statistical method based on the work by Abramowski and co-authors. Here, there are no age restrictions. And basically, this automated matching looks at the phonetic distance between names reported in the list of rebels and names reported in the census. And again, we have a more conservative measure and a more and the less conservative one. So when we were considering these two matching techniques, really the point is, are they substitutes? Are they complements? And the way we see it is that the manual matching really allow us to identify female rebels, thanks to the names. It also allows to identify the most famous rebels and the ones that you find in history books, but also rebels with a less common last name. The automated matching instead does better in matching the more common names. And so overall, we consider these two techniques as complements rather than substitutes. If you're wondering about the matching rate, it is 24%. And although we would have loved to have it higher, I mean, it is in line with the literature. And I have to say that even for the manual matching, we basically had research assistants redoing the matching. So basically going over and over the same list. So having different research assistants working on the same task, basically. So so for each rebel, what we do is for each individual, actually, what we do is to look at the place where they were born. And so if you look at the geographical distribution of rebels by county of birth, this is how the map looks like.
Gaia, can I ask something?
Yes, sure.
So do you need to do a one-to-one matching, or you couldn't create a matching to link the rebel to an area, a high probability area where the surname and first name might be common, or the surname and...
We always thought we would do this analysis at the individual level. So that's why it has always been in our mind to do a one-to-one matching at the individual level rather than the area. But I'll take note.
Because now we're going to link this to geographical data, right? And this geographical data is going to be at the county. Yeah.
So we will have we will have a county level, but also barony level, which is a higher level of geographical disaggregation.
Yeah. So if all the Joan Smiths comes from one barony, then it's like, it doesn't matter that you haven't managed to manage that guy, to find that guy, right?
We will. Let me come back to this, because actually the geographical dispersion of last names will be important for us. So let me come back to this. Okay, so I was saying that the demographic impact of the famine was immediate, but the evidence is that during the famine itself, sorry, let me step back. So we'll talk about the rebellion and how we identify the rebels. And so the question is, what happened during the famine? Do you observe that there were episodes of rebellion during the famine itself? Now, the historical evidence seems to point out that even though the demographic impact was immediate, the type of acts of rebellion that we saw during the famine was very limited because, people were debilitated. They were coming from a period of long starvation. So the only acts of violence, if you wish, that we find evidence for in history is really, say, acts against property. So people stealing grains, for example. And so what we think is that while the famine happened in the mid-19th century, what happened was that there wasn't really a rebellion at the time because the institutional setup was not ready, because people were debilitated. Can you hear me?
It was an accident, I think.
Okay.
Sorry.
And so the idea is that political motivated rebellion smoldered under the surface for several years after the famine. And this links also to other studies, more contemporary studies that look at how past memories can be reactivated after many years. And this is, for example, the work by Foucault and Voss on Greece.
Can I ask something else? I think there's a, is the argument here that the food crisis leads to rebellion, or that, and then if the food crisis had happened in England, rebellion would have a reason in England against powers that be? Or is it that food crisis led to a response to the government that was subpar compared to what you have been in England? And if that is the case, do you have anecdotal or empirical evidence of that?
Yes. So the evidence that was really what I was mentioning earlier in terms of the work by Cormac O'Grady, that's stressing the fact that there was a recognition at the time, and even now retrospectively, that the kind of support that was provided was minimal, if not close to zero at the time. And I'll explore the mechanism later, but basically I will highlight, I can do this now actually, in terms of, these are two sentences from two historians, so showing how the famine left an imprint and memories that went across generations. So really the story that we're going to tell is the story of the fact that the large negative shock that was the famine left a kind of legacy of rebellion that was transmitted across generations and eventually exploded in 1916 and onwards. So the idea is there was a recognition that the relief that was provided was close to nothing, and that more could have been done. And that's why I was mentioning Amartya Sen and his description of what happened during the famine as a case of cultural alienation. I think that's very important to remember. So in terms of how we measure the famine, we have three different measures of the famine. So for each individual in the census that we use, we will look at where they were born, and we're going to measure the extent of the famine in their place of birth. And we have three measures. Two measures are at county level. One is potato crop failure between 1845 and 1846. And this is based on the work by Burke. The second measure, still at county level, is excess during the famine. And this is based on the work of another historian, Cousins. So these are two measures that are at a more aggregate level geographically. And what Battista and I have been trying really is to try to get information about the severity of the famine at a more disaggregated level. And if you want, in terms of the geographical level of disaggregation that we look at counties. We have two measures at county level, and then we look at the next step of disaggregation, which is baronies. Now, the reason why we cannot, we only have one measure based on baronies is for various reasons. Whenever we look at information at barony level, we encounter two main issues. The first one is that in the census, the actual questionnaire question was, where were you born? And 40% of the people in the sample, they say exactly the townland of origin. So really the place, the town of birth. Many people, when they reply to this question, they might have said, oh, I was born in County Galway, for example. So the information is only available at county level for some individuals. But there is also another issue, and the issue is that individuals might have simply said, I'm from Galway, without specifying whether that is Galway City or County Galway. So there are issues in terms of using more disaggregated data at a geographical level. In any case, we do have this measure that is measuring the extent of the famine at barony level. And this is based on the work by Goodspeed that collected data on the blight presence at barony level based on reports of the Parliamentary Relief Commission. So, so overall, we have three measures of the famine, two at county level and one at barony level. And when we look at one of these measures, for example, potato crop failure rate between 1846 and 1845, this is how the map of Ireland looks like. Okay, so what are we going to analyze? We're going to analyze the determinants of being a rebel. And we're going to look at the short-run determinants, so individual characteristics, age, marital status, religion, and so on. And we're going to look at the long-run determinants of rebellion, so this large negative shock. And so the dependent variable is an indicator that takes the value 1 if an individual I born in location J living in district D at the time of the census takes part to rebellion activities, and 0 otherwise. And we have then as a main independent variable our measures of the extent of the famine in location of origin J. And so we will show our specification using the 3 different measures of the famine. So what is the idea? The idea is that we're going to explore whether these large negative shocks that happened in the past 2 generations before the rebellion actually are still affecting subsequent generations. We have a set of controls at individual level, at a county level, country of birth level, and also at district of residence in 1911. And so this is really the main table, the first table of results. So we have our dependent variable, whether the individual took part in the rebellion or not. And in the first 2 columns, we have the first measure at county level, that is crop failure rate. And what you see is that there exists a positive association between the extent of the famine, the severity of the famine in your place of birth, and the probability of being a rebel. And, the results are consistent also when we use the alternative measure of the famine, which is excess mortality. And in the last 2 columns, I should say, here we control for individual controls, and we have a bunch of other controls at location level, country, location level, or let's say residence level.
Sorry, can I ask, do you have density of population there? What's it look like?
So we have actually various. So what we have is the share of young individuals living in your district, which is basically it's larger than your neighborhood, but basically it's the area where you live. We have the share of Catholics living in your electoral district, and the share of people who are literate in your district. So we have, especially in, I would say, in our idea, it wasn't so much the density was, are there many young men living in your district, and how that could affect the probability that you then take part in the rebellion?
Okay, I just have to think why I think density of population is important. Like, I can't say it right now.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I have also a kind of a question. So the outcome, what was the share of people who are rebels first?
No, this is really whether you are rebel or not. So
yeah. No, but what is in the population? What's the share of people who are?
Share, sorry, is 0.05%.
Okay. And my other question was, so we know that that's measured with noise because the matching's imperfect, right?
Yeah.
Do we expect that creates any problems? So because there's that measurement problem, are there any characteristics we may worry about in the people who don't get matched?
Oh, that's a very good point. And actually, I should have had. We actually do the analysis of the individuals who don't get matched, and we don't find any difference in terms of gender. Sorry, I don't have the table here. It's in the appendix in the paper. We don't find any difference in terms of gender, and actually this should address also your question. And also, there was something else, but we don't find any red flag, let me say, in terms of understanding who we didn't manage to match. Thank you for the question. Now, this is very important indeed. Sorry, I should have said this earlier.
So one question, sorry, very interesting paper, by the way. So about the size of the coefficient, because it looks very, very small. So I was wondering, could you interpret that for us, please?
Sure. The coefficients are small. And so basically the idea is that, for example, for a potato crop failure, 1% increase in potato crop failure leads to an increase by 0.033 percentage points in the probability of becoming a rebel, or being a rebel. Now think about this, that in terms of crop failure rates could be as high as 68%. So I think that's the maximum that we observe in that specific year. So a 1% increase is not, I mean, it could be substantial. So basically, while the coefficient seems small, if you think about the extent of crop failure at county level, they are not as small.
So maybe if they were standardized, would that be more clear, like to visualize the impact of the...
I agree. Yes, thank you. Thank you. We also control for other concurring factors, such as previous rebellions in Irish history and a measure of social capital, which is given by these GA clubs. It's only 2 lines in this slide, but it was the work of a few weeks to get that measure. But unfortunately, basically that measure of social capital doesn't appear to be relevant. But anyway, so just to say that we look at many other concurring factors. As I said, so far I've shown just the relationship between the association between the famine, the extent of the famine, and the probability of being a rebel. And there was, as I was mentioning, there is this idea that that the famine left a legacy of rebellion that eventually led to the rebellion in 1916 until 1921. And this is what I was telling you about the historian saying that the famine left an imprinting of the suffering and trauma lasting for generations, and we are all the children of the famine. Just as a check, what we did was to look for the number of times that the word famine appears on Irish newspapers during the period of the revolution. And as you can see, there is a spike in the number of times that the famine word is mentioned in Irish newspapers around the period of the revolution here between 1916 until 1921. And this is just to kind of shed a bit of light. Was the famine really becoming prominent in the public discourse, and how that was linked maybe to the Irish Revolution itself? But of course, if we're talking about intergenerational transmission, we have to talk about fathers and children. So here we're talking about 2 events that are separated by 2 generations. Unfortunately, due to data availability, it is not possible to reconstruct the genealogical trees of Irish families. And so what we do is, and this goes back to Leandro's point, and I hope that I will convince you, we look at the geographical distribution of surnames across different time periods. And to do so, we look at data on distribution of family names in mid-17th century with a down survey during the period of the famine on the basis of the Griffith valuation and, of course, the census data. So what we do is, well, we do 2 types of exercises in terms of really of exploring the mechanism and how this intergenerational transmission of rebellion could have worked. The first one is to analyze family names exposure to the famine. And so we basically measure the share. So for each surname, we look at the geographic distribution in the 17th century, so before the famine, and just a couple of years since the start of the famine with the Griffith survey. And we look at the difference for each surnames in terms of how much that distribution changes between these 2 time periods. And the way we interpret this difference is in terms of how much was your last names exposed to the famine. And so in the presence of intergenerational transmission, we would expect that individuals whose last names were more exposed to the famine are then more likely to rebel. this is the first exercise. The second exercise to understand better the mechanism of intergenerational transmission is to use the predictive value of the famine on the basis of last names. So we adopt a technique similarly to Blickley and Ferry, where we basically regress the famine on family names, and then we get the predicted value of the famine on the basis of these last names, and we use it in our specification. And so again, if in the presence of intergenerational transmission, we would expect that this predicted value of the famine on the basis of last names to be positively associated to the probability of being a rebel.
So just to clarify,
yes,
the point number 1 that you showed, so it's the correlation between exposure to last names and the rebelliousness of a last name, right?
No, so here we're looking at the distribution, the geographical distribution of last names in the 17th century and just after. Or during the
so
period
that
of
estimates how exposed the last name is.
Exactly.
So my question is, do you use that to also corroborate the findings that you've done with the census, just because you wouldn't need to do the matching, so you would have your entire population of last names that are rebellious, so you could do kind of a gross correlation between, at the last name level, how exposed the last name is to the famine with how rebellious a last name is.
Okay. Okay, I see.
It's kind of a corroboration exercise that doesn't, you won't have the attrition problem that you have in the census.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this is I'm aware of running a bit up out of time. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So this is a specification in which we explore this intergenerational transmission. So in the first 4 columns, we insert this measure of exposure to the famine at surname level, and we find a positive relationship. And this is true not just for the entire sample, but more so even when we just consider men, given the patrilineal relationship of last names. And the next 4 columns also explore the second exercise, so the predictive value of last names. And so this would be basically the predictive value of the famine on the basis of last names. And when we insert in the specification instead of our main variable of the famine, we see that still it is positive and statistically significant, so positive association with the probability of becoming a rebel. So in a way, we hope that this table can convince you that there is a channel of intergenerational transmission on the basis of last names. But of course, there might be other issues in what we do, and mainly related to the fact that we're using historical sources. There could be measurement errors. There could be other confounding factors. And so in order to address all of this, we and here I should thank really Battista for doing this. We explored much more how the potato blight that led to the famine, how the potato blight spread. And so in the search of an instrumental variable, we explored the field of phytopathology, which is the field that analyzes the diffusion of blight. And in doing so, what we did was, well, first of all, the potato blight is an example of a spread of a fungus in a country that has a flat terrain, and many of the phytopathologists analyzing the spread of the blight say, well, this is the one case in which really the spread of the blight is exogenous. It's mainly happening by air or by water. And so what we do basically is to look at the potato blight infection rate, which is given by the difference between the amount of infected plants in a particular area compared to the infection rate that is present in nearest surroundings. So our instrumental variable will be based on this infection rate that is made by 2 components. The first one is the difference. Sorry, is the extent of soil suitability for potato cultivation in a given barony. And we compare it, we take the difference with respect to the average soil suitability for potato cultivation of a set of selected nearby baronies. So if you wish, this is a donut kind of instrument. And how do we select these neighboring baronies? What we look at is we use information about wind direction at the time of the blight arrived in Ireland in August, September 1845. So let me show you a map that I hope will help you understand what the instrument is. So let's consider this barony, Athlone, and all the baronies in white are the direct neighbors of the barony Athlone. So we're going to look at soil suitability for potato production of Athlone, and we're going to take the difference between soil suitability here in Athlone and the soil suitability of these baronies that are the neighbors of the neighbors, but not all neighbors of neighbors will be considered. I don't know if you see, there are here arrows that represent wind direction. So we're going to use the information of wind direction between August and September 1845 to determine which baronies are the ones that are more relevant for barony Athlone. And we're going to compare, therefore, we're going to take the difference between soil suitability to potato production for Athlone minus soil suitability of these selected baronies. And so we conduct our instrumental variable analysis on the basis of these instruments. This specification is a barony level, given that we needed the highest level of disaggregation of the data, and the results confirm what we found in the basic linear probability model specification. So I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so very quickly, we did a few placebo tests for our IV. The first placebo test was to basically construct the same type of instrument for each year between 1851 and 1950, so the 100 years after the famine. And we'll look at the wind direction in August, September of each of these years. And only in 8.8% of cases, the blight indicator is statistically significant for this placebo instrumental variable. So this should corroborate the fact that, the actual instrumental variable that we use is a relevant one. We do also a second placebo test, and this placebo test is to say, well, instead of considering wind direction during the period of the start of the famine, let's consider wind direction on a date that is related to the rebellion. So here we pick the day before the first act of rebellion, the day before the Easter Rising. And so we look at the wind direction on that date, 23rd of April, 1916, and basically build this placebo instrumental variable to see whether taking another date for another wind direction, whether this affects the probability of being a rebel, and we find that basically that the instrument based on this placebo, of course, doesn't work. And finally, in the third placebo test, we'll look at the neighbors of neighbors that we had excluded because the wind wasn't going through them. And so we construct an alternative placebo instrument based on the baronies excluded from this Eden donut that we use. And we would not expect this placebo instrument to be correlated with a blight indicator, and the instrumental variable analysis shouldn't produce any statistically significant coefficients. This is indeed the case. So last slide. So this study really looks at the question of what makes a rebel from a short-run perspective and a long-run perspective. And we analyze mainly the intergenerational transmission of rebellion that is generated by a large negative shock. And we are able to identify the features of rebels, and we are able to provide corroboration of the fact that the famine, this large negative shock, really left a legacy of rebellion that lasted until the revolution in 2 generations afterwards. And hopefully we hope that we can contribute more in general to the discussion in terms of the drivers of rebellion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So please join me with a round of applause for Gaia. Thank you very much for presenting your paper. I am going to stop the